It is indeed my honor and pleasure to introduce to our keynote speaker, Brother Maxime Allard. Brother Maxime Allard was born in Quebec City long times ago in 1962, and he is a Dominican brother from the Canadian province. Currently, he's lecturing at Dominican University College and at Collège Néoclassique in philosophy and theology at Dominican University College, and on social and political issues at Collège Néoclassique. He holds the Lawrence Dewan Chair in St. Thomas Aquinas and philosophy at Dominican University College. For many years, while lecturing, he served in the administration of Dominican University College, first of all as a registrar, as vice president of the university, and for 10 years as his president. Trained in philosophy, especially political philosophy, philosophy of religion, hermeneutics in Aquinas, and in 17th continental philosophy, and also in theology, especially in ethics. Maxime lectured in Lille, in France, as a visitor for 17 years. He lectured also in South Africa near the end of apartheid for 3 years. Regularly, he has been going to Rwanda for 9 years. He traveled to Rwanda and to Burundi to lecture and help out in the Dominican formation for the novices. In his province, he was a student master for 8 years and have been privileged to be one of his students. He has been collaborating for more than 30 years to Vie Liturgique and other liturgical magazines. He's now involved in many different types of innovations and of training on social and political issues, specializing in the rhetorical analysis of theses. By the way, after his talk with us, he's going back to his graduate seminar on upheavals, on insurrections and revolutions. I hope he's not going to do it. But before he goes on his upheavals, let us be revolutionary by building up a wider we. We welcome you, dear brother Maxime, in our way to help us to widen it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. English is not my first language, but I usually get by. So if there's any way you're not understanding me, just call on me. I'll translate from whatever language I was attempting to American. So I've prepared a PowerPoint because Dieudonné asked me to, and I'm an obedient little brother. And since I'm in the last few weeks, I've been pushing his name for next provincial, just to annoy him and a few other people. But I do believe he would do it well too. But so I've prepared something in kind of 3 moments. The first moment is trying to understand what it means when we say we, or we think of ourselves as a group, as a we, because before widening it, it's good to know who we are. The second point, it would be more about internally, as Dominicans for Justice and Peace, promotion, integrity of creation, how do we experience that in ourselves? And then the last, which will be briefer, a series of questions to help you sort these elements out to organize for widening the we. And then in the discussion, we can get more particular if you want. But I always find it difficult to give recipes or processes until I know who I'm talking to and who I will be with. Since I didn't know you, I didn't go too far in that direction, but we can chat about it later, and who knows, that might lead to more discussions together. So without further ado, I will share with you the PowerPoint and try to address the point of today. Now, if you do have questions as we're going on, I can't see the chat really from here, but in the break, I'll read the questions and we can start with that after the break. So it's going to be explorations, and I have not necessarily all the answers to everything, but I'm proposing a path. So we begin with we. It seems obvious we are Americans, Canadian, Catholic, Dominicans, but is it so simple who we are? Well, there's laity, sisters, brothers. There's obviously older people, just look at my hair, and there's a few younger ones. We come from different provinces, congregation, national origins, and that has an impact on how we think of ourselves as we. We are, I imagine, ideologically diverse, even if we have emphasis on political and ethical manifestations, but there are differences, I'm sure, even if I haven't spoken to many of you. Amongst we, there are definitely leaders, and then there's people like me that are followers. I'm a very good, beautiful little sheep. I get lost often, but there's also social origins that are different. You've got thinkers and doers in any groups. Should I dare add sexual orientation? Yes, because I'm sure it is, if not amongst us as a group today, definitely in the groups fighting for justice, peace, and integrity of creation. There's always that. We come from different economical milieu, and our engagement with justice and peace are different. But we say, well, you say, but I'll be saying we because I'm talking with you, we say that we truly are a we. But our composition is already diverse. Let's get dramatic a bit more. Who died so that we could be together? Well, we didn't invent the wheel, and probably many of you had sisters or brothers in your congregations that were already talking and doing things about justice and peace in your congregations, so that you got interested in that. Okay, who's included or excluded of the possibility of saying we or our, like in the Our Father, for example? Very interesting. Theology and liturgy is always fun. We say Our Father, and since Cyprian, we insist it's not my Father, but our Father. And we have no problem with that. But move to the creed, and you will say, credo, I believe. You don't say we believe, okay? And it's always fun during the Easter vigil or at baptism, you ask the question, do you believe in God the Father, et cetera, et cetera? And people say, because they're together, they say we. But liturgically, you're supposed to say I. What is it with sometimes we say I and some other times we say we? Metaphysical questions there, but I won't deal with that with you today, except if you really are in need of penance, we can do that during the question period. Each of us can say, may say we, with different extensions, with different understanding of what makes us a we, and how we've been brought together in such a situation where we can be said, where we can say of us that we constitute a unity. Some of you are there because you've chosen to be there. Others have been appointed by provincials or priors or chapters. It's not the same thing, okay? So there are different types of we because there's different type of unity, unification, or uniformization. Of course, the last one is definitely not Dominican, but Dominicans sometimes have Jesuitic tendencies. And we need to be cured from that. But unity and unification we're good at, okay? So let's start with something you know about we. We seems to be, especially for our point. And as most of you are American, I chose the more fundamental we, which is we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, we do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. I'm sure some of you have had to say this in public at some point. So there's a sense here, and it's very American, sense of who we are. We as a people, we as a group, we can organize justice. We can want to promote good things, okay? And in order to do that, we've got to give ourselves some type of constitution. We'll get back to that when we get to the smaller we that we are today. But when we say we, like that, we the people, I'm always afraid that we tend to be too romantic. So, because I'm not very romantic, Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Mao, Duvalier, and others also said, we the people, okay? They said it in the name of the people, instead of the people, for the people, but they didn't necessarily promote everything that was in the American Declaration. But this leads me to question, who tells whom, sorry for the mistake, to say we, and who has a say in saying we? When the American Constitution was voted and proclaimed and the text was made, there was definitely a sense of the we, but you had people in what was to become the United States who didn't have a say in that we. I'm thinking of certain groups on the southern part of the colonies then. We is always, in that sense, the result of a partition, of a distribution. If there is we, there is them, and there's you, okay? There's already us and them, the friends and the foes. And there's always all the ones that are ignored, invisible, uncared for, that are not yet friends or foes, but we do not integrate them in there and they don't want to be there. And in that sense, because there's partition and distribution, we is already the fruit of history of struggle, hurts, victims, victors, losers, fruit of choices, consents, domination, and subjectification, okay? We might not like to think about it that way, but this is a reality. You've lived it in your congregations, you live it in the States, we live it in the world. So I'm proposing a different approach to we. It comes from my being South African, and at least in part of my heart. This is the beginning of the Constitution of 1994 in South Africa. You see, they'll construct the we in a totally different way. We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past. We honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land. Respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. In 1870 something, when the American Constitution was drafted, that could not have been written because it would not have been true. We therefore, through our freely elected representative, adopt this Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic, so as to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. That should say something to us here. Lay the foundations for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law. As we see currently in South Africa, it's not the case yet. There's looting and upheavals these days because of an ex-president who was not a saint. Improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person, and build a united and democratic South Africa, able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. A lot of that could be signed by all Catholics. Next part, may God protect our people. Kosi sikalele Afrika, morena boloka, sehaba seheso, hotshein South Africa. God bless South Africa. Mudzimu fachu seda Afrika, hosika tekiza Afrika. Sounds weird to say it like that. My accent in Xhosa and Zulu is not perfect, but the point is they integrate linguistic differences because it makes and has an impact on how justice and peace come about, especially with the division in South Africa. But I take this text as a starting point because it's definitely built on a larger we than the white Afrikaans English previous ones. It is a we that is difficult to say as one, as we, because of the linguistic differences. It says its history and the challenges to widen the we and make it real and not just programmatic. We here today can come to learn from the difficulty of saying this we as much as from its preposition. Maybe, and that's what I propose, that we learn today like Robert Kennedy in other times in Cape Town in '66. He visited and he wrote this. Well, he said this. I come here this evening because of my deep interest and affection for a land settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, then taken over by the British, and at last independent, a land in which the native inhabitants were at first subdued, but relation with whom remain a problem to this day, a land which defined itself on a hostile frontier, a land which has tamed rich natural resources through the energetic application of modern technology, a land which was once the importer of slaves and must now struggle to wipe out the last traces of that former bondage. And he felt he had to conclude by saying, I refer, of course, not to South Africa, but to the United States of America. Nice way of bringing in all sorts of problems. Okay, so that's where I situate myself. In the wake of the South African Constitution and of Robert Kennedy's understanding that we, the people in the United States, have a tough history, which is very present. I don't need to remind that to you because of you're involved in that. Now, it's about building a wider we, and it's not about us. And that's important to take into consideration. Okay, we tend to forget this. What's the difference between we and us? We could go into a long philosophical discussion on this, but basically, we is the subject. It's someone who's speaking, someone who says something about that person who's speaking and others he or she is with. Us, on the other hand, is an object, that which we speak about. Now, if I was to ask you to define yourself as a we, and I will at the end, for you as capable of saying we, who is us? Okay. Depending on how you'll answer that, and we'll come to that in the discussion later, you will be able to widen yourself or not, or you'll be able to open yourself to some groups and not others. Okay. And we always speak like that. We always have a predetermined idea of us because we fear the indefinite. We fear the chaos, the unruly. We need borders and frontiers in all sorts of ways. If it's about widening it, it's about not just opening the frontiers, but moving them further away. But when we say us or we're saying we're talking closure and enclosure, okay? As however we want or say we want to have a wider we, there is still at every point already some type of closure, a limiting criteria which determined that we, as an ethical we, as a means towards something else. Okay, we are Dominicans. We are not Jesuits or we're not others. Doesn't mean they're not doing a great job, but that is closure. Okay, if you're to widen it to, let's say, Jesuits, well, it will involve a transformation of the us in ways that need to be thought about. So there is that, pre-reflexive understanding of who we are and of the us we constitute. But we need to ask ourselves, who is excluded? And sometimes even without us thinking about it. Just a questioning. For example, if someone were to say, I come to the questions of justice from a strict Marxian or Leninist perspective. Okay. Would you let that person in, the we? Even if that person went to communion every Sunday. Okay. If someone was to say, I come here from a very feminist, let's say Nancy Fraser or Sheila Benhabib perspective, maybe you know these women, very interesting thinkers, American ones. Well, would you let them necessarily come in because of all the implications that come with it? Okay. So the question is, in that sense, who do we exclude and who do we include consciously and unconsciously? How are the previous and the next generations included? Most of us are, let's put it like delicately, we're older, okay? Aristotle would have said we're already very corrupting, and many of us will not see the year 2030, okay? Sorry if that troubles you, but that's the case. But how do we make it possible for others to engage with us? And how do we remember, commemorate those who have made it possible for us to be? Okay. Now, as us, as a we, which type of recognition do we give to each other? Okay. And here I work from Axel Honneth. He defines 3 types of solidarity, of recognition. Recognition in the family, oh, sorry, this is not, we don't want this yet. Recognition happens in families in terms of love, hopefully, okay? My mother, she loves me. I love my father, he loves me. I love my brothers and sisters. And it's very effective, and it's linked to a dailiness in terms of recognition, because you have a view and interaction with others, which you do not have necessarily in other types of circles. So do you consider yourselves, or do we consider ourselves as forming a family with that type of expectation in terms of recognition? In that type of recognition, for example, Didi's absence today because of health issues and things like that is loving and caring, which is the type of recognition we have in a family. But when it comes to recognition, if we're workers together, the type of recognition is structured around rights, workers' rights. Unions are strong with that, but there's beyond unions all sorts of other ways of understanding it. But if you recognize who you are together, forming the we, in terms of who has rights and who doesn't, or which rights are those of the men, the women, the young, the old, etc., etc., and how do we say equality of recognition? And do we say it in terms of rights? Question, I don't know. There's a third level, which has nothing to do with love. You know, I might be in a group forming a we where we don't love one another, where we do not work with one another, and the rights of workers do not apply, but we share values, we share goals. And it's because we share those goals that we're together. So how does one recognize someone sharing values with us when we don't live together? So that comes in as to how we understand who we are. And trust me, these type of differences eventually make a difference in how we operate as a we and how we widen or not the we. If you think of yourselves as a loving group and someone who in all sorts of ways would be in tune with you, but you work on the model of a family and that person doesn't care about your love, will that person be part and parcel of the wider we? Okay, so that's one way of approaching it. Another way of approaching it is, and I'm using here not Axel Honneth, but Boltanski, French sociologist, he says we form cities in which there are types of agreements and processes to reconcile one another. Cities where there's what he calls an economy of worth. For example, if you're the type projects, always new projects, always wants something new, well, in a domestic city, you will not fit, because domestic city is all about traditions, and we do what has been done always. If you're in a group where people say, we've got to do what we've always done, and you want to do something new, you've got to argue for it and agree about it differently than if you're in, for example, a merchant, what he calls a merchant city, where it's all about new projects, new things, to get new things going. You don't argue the same way, okay? For example, if I was with a group of brothers and sisters, very, very, very much right-wing, and I do not know where you stand, so I say it totally naively, and I made sure I didn't ask Dieudonné anything about that. So let's say some of you are very right-wing, very much into Latin masses and more traditional aspects of the church like that. Well, I will not argue in the same way as if I'm with, in French we say 68, people who marched in 68, burned the bras, and were against Vietnam, okay? But you need to know what type of we want to be forming together, so that when there's a disagreement, when there's a need for reconciliation, you put up the proper processes, okay? Think of it this way. If you're a good bourgeois capitalist of the 19th century, you're good, you're Catholic, you will bring a chicken to, I think it's Baby George, he was called in Dickens' story, and you'll think you did something great. You think of yourself as family, you're doing charity, but this will not change the conditions of work of the people. So it does not solve any problem. It's a good thing, but it's not for the right city, okay? So when we are already existing, conscious of ourselves, how do we operate, okay? There's three aspects, especially when we want to think in terms of widening the we. There's testings, there's trials. The Greek word behind testing, trial here is peirasmos. It sounds nice to say a Greek word in this type of assembly, and peirasmos is the word we translate as temptation, okay? Where you've got to make choices. So we test who we are, and there are internal tests, and then you have people pass tests to come in. There's problems with planning and being able to expect the unexpected, okay? If you're to widen the we, you've got to be expecting the unexpected. If you don't, well, borders will not change. With you today, I chose to focus on testing, okay? Because I think internally, so that we are happy and able to widen it, we need to be able to go through three types of tests, okay? So I will send Brendan the whole thing. I'm not going to read this slide, but it gives more, quote unquote, theoretical elements, which we might talk about later, but you can read it later. But I'm more interested in three types of tests: truth tests, reality tests, and existential tests. Again, those are not mine. Those are Boltanski and Thévenot's ideas, okay? But why do I think they're interesting and useful for a we about social justice? Truth test is about affirming the social order, affirming the order, the group, the reality we already are. In that sense, also use a liturgical example. When Brendan is presiding the Eucharist with Dieudonné, okay, for example, I imagine both of them are priests, and you know, Dieudonné, charismatic, young, African, born near the border of Congo, they like to sing for hours and invent things, okay, and dance and have their body move in ways which some Caucasian Americans, my experience, I know do not appreciate, okay? I've lived long enough in Rwanda to know that. For certain years in the late 90s, student brothers were sent to be exposed to Rwanda's situation after the genocide and the events of '94. And it was always fun to see the American reactions of some brothers. They didn't send sisters, so I only know about the brothers, reacting and saying, this is not truly a Roman Catholic liturgy. Okay. Or a French deacon, not Dominican. I don't know English. I learned English with sailors, so very stuck up, broom up the ass person. He's there, deacon. And in Rwanda in those years, we had the women who were breastfeeding on the front row. And, well, most of you probably have not breastfed, or at least you haven't shared it with all your sisters as openly as other things you've shared. Well, he thought that you can't have that. It's not in the proper order. I told him I saw nothing in canon law and the ritual against that. So I passed a test. He didn't. Reality test is something different. It's the type of trials we go through when in the way we work, someone points to inconsistencies. They're not against what we're for, but they're saying, because we want and care for who we are, well, we're being inconsistent here and something needs to be done about it. That's another type of trial. And sometimes there are moments in the life of some groups that they're more with truth tests than reality tests, but you got this other type of test. And then there is the existential test, unmasking the incompleteness and contingency of our reality. Okay. For example, and I was, Jidani reminded me of that, and also at the beginning of the talk, I heard about it. For the longest time, Dominicans were promoters of justice and peace. And recently, in the title itself and in the document Brendan sent with the agenda, it's now justice and peace and integrity of creation. That's what I call an existential test. We thought we had it nicely packaged under justice and peace. Well, reality has catched us, and because of that, we decided to add it. But you could say, no, we don't need that, or it's already included. But because of the reality of how the ecological and integrity of creation questions and problems existentially affect all of us, or some of us, you chose to integrate it. So in a way, you went through a test and you passed it in that way, okay? So, being tested, planning, are both ways of, at the heart of how do we think of the possibility of enlarging, of widening in two terms, in terms of welcoming new people, okay, and of readjusting the borders, okay. But whereas for the three types of tests, I think it covers the fullness of what can happen. Planning, and some of you, I'm sure, are very good planners. You've had responsibilities in your congregations or provinces. You know what planning is? It's wanting to master what is to come. And you've got two types of planners. You got the planners who want to integrate everything that might happen and think about it in such a way that they are totally in control. Okay. In French, we have a word for that, but I will not use it because I don't know how to translate it. But there's always also a way of planning prudently, which is about accepting that I do not master everything. We, as promoters of justice and peace, we do not control everything about even us being together for justice and peace and integrity of creation. But accepting that is not always easy. Depending on how you relate to that, you will not be opened to others or to widening in the same way. And the unexpected causes fear. I'm not just talking about novelties, because you can think of novelties coming up. We already know that there's going to be Windows 11. If it's not on the way, it's going to be coming. Of course, we might be a bit uneasy about, oh, they're going to change our world again. But we know that Windows 12 will come up at some point. Okay, it's one thing to know about it. It's another way of being passionate about being open. Hospitality risks always having limits. Okay, I'll share you a family story before moving on. My grandmother was very hospitable. She had what we call in French un banc du quêteux, that is, in the front porch, there was a bench that you could sleep on, there was blankets under, and regularly she would put food there. And whoever, she had discovered that from her mother during the Depression in the wake of 1929. And at one point, Grandpa died and Grandma kept doing that. Grandpa, by the way, was over 6 feet and weighed more than 400 pounds. So very, you could feel safe with him around. But when Grandma started to live together after Grandpa died, she kept doing that, putting food out and making sure the blanket was there, and sometimes a bit of money. And an aunt, a sister-in-law of hers, says, "You can't do that. You shouldn't do that. It's dangerous. All sorts of people come in and could want to go further in the house, and you really don't have a good lock between that." And Grandma said, "Well, I take whoever God sends my way." She had a passion. She was open like that. But her sister-in-law was more about, I want to control, I've got criteria about who can come in and who I can expect. The others don't come in. Okay. So it is a question about how we think are we. Okay. Now I go into types of questions nearing the end of my talk, because I was given 45 minutes. If you had time, and I don't know how you're going to organize the rest of your meeting and the next ones, but how do you describe and define yourselves? The pamphlet that was sent to us, I analyzed rhetorically. I had lots of fun. And it's a beginning. But what would be an interesting exercise to do, even for the one that only has now 2 3/4 days left. I forget her name, though. I'm bad with names. But how do each one of you define or describe who this we that you form is? How do you articulate your common identity? What does it rest on? The fact that you're Dominicans? Or the fact, what would you put first? Interest for justice, peace, integrity of creation, or being Dominican? The order you choose for the description will change how you will think of the we and widened. So what type of common identity? Do you think it's linked to facts, objective ones, brothers from every province and in North America and vicariate, a sister from every congregation, etc., etc.? Is that this type of identity you have, and is that how you contribute to organizing and orchestrating the we? Or do you think of yourselves as having a munus? Munus is a Latin word that you recognize. So you can say, I gave you a Greek word, a Latin word, and if you want, I can give you a German word at some point. I've given you African languages too, so very multilingualistic here. But what's a munus? It has to do with community. How do you define a community? Is it bringing unity to things that are the same and you bring them together? So you have a unity and a community of people that are the same. Well, they're Dominicans and they're for justice, etc. Or are you brought together because you have a munus? Now, munus is not a word we use a lot, but it's in immunity. It has certain words in English have it in. But munus is basically a task, a mission. Okay. Do I come to the order because I like the habit and I like the history of the Dominicans and I like the identity we have in the church? Or do I come to Dominicans because I like their task and their mission? Do I come in the we of people, justice and peace, because I want to have brothers and sisters with whom I can share this passion I have for justice, peace, or integrity of creation? Or do I come in this we because I want to be part of this mission, which is not the same thing. You won't participate and be in there in the same way. Okay. And in that sense, how do, let me just not, I'm missing, sorry, I went too quickly. How do we delimit ourselves? And how do we think of the others that are not us? Is it because we think of them, there's two ways of going about this. We think they're others because they do not believe, act, share our ideals of being Dominican or justice. Or are we talking about people who would be outrightly against us? Not the same thing. And God knows, I mean, in polarized situations, like some people say the US are, I'm not a specialist at all of US situations, so I do not know, and I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. But in polarized situations, easily when someone does not believe exactly the way I believe things and do not orchestrate in the same way, immediately they get classified as against us. But that defines how we will widen or not. Okay. And it's not just about us and those who are not sharing necessarily our beliefs or our mission or are against us. There's also, and I think it's important, that's usually forgotten, do we agree who the people we are there for, who we stand for, are all about? Okay. It's easy to define yourselves. It's easy to find your enemies. We're good at that. And if we don't have any, we invent some. But if we have a munus, if we have a mission, we have a mission for others. But these others you have a mission towards, you can be very, excuse my use of the language, very paternalistic or maternalistic towards them. Or you can think of them as basically passive people whom you're there to do something for in terms of saving, helping, etc. But you can also recognize them as equal with whom you're going to be doing something, as opposed to, don't worry, I'll do it for you. Okay. And depending on how you think the people you're there to be with, help, and be for, how you think of them as objects of your care or as co-subject of bringing justice about. In the history of justice and peace in Dominican order, the two possibilities have existed. I don't know where you are. Okay. Next point. Sorry, I'm getting. Okay. I'm getting more towards us now because it's time to start concluding. All of what I was saying was kind of theoretical and about groups in general. In the examples, I tried to bring it on more towards us. But the we form together today and with the other people in this, the group you form, okay? You gather around ideas, projects, etc., etc. Okay, and they're about justice and peace. Now let's be real. Let's be theological. Peace is an eschatological thing. Okay. The only real peace we can have on this side of the world is cemeteries. It's dead. Okay. But real peace, the peace we're longing for, is eschatological. So what we'll have will be either symbols, sacraments, hopes of peace, but real peace we can't have fully. Okay. It doesn't mean we're all fighting, don't worry. I'm going to be bringing the word concord later. And in terms of justice, well, the only real, full, complete justice will be messianic. And the church is not the one bringing the kingdom. The kingdom comes by God's will. Okay. So I start with that because I'm old in the order, not as old as some of you, but as old in the order. And I remember working in the 80s when I was a young Dominican with people in justice and peace, and you thought that they had forgotten about these two things. It was, we have to bring it today, and what we think justice is what justice is, and we're going to make it happen today. Well, their ideas of justice was just one idea amongst others. So in your group, what is the idea of justice, and what's your timeline in that sense? This is what eschatology and messianic is all about. What's our relationship to time, opportunities, rhythms, schedules? How, in terms of who we are as a group, how do we inform each other? And how do we report to others about us? It helps us define who we are and enlarge it. How do we, as we discover that our idea of justice is limited and others are bringing more aspects, how do we integrate these people? Do we just integrate Dominicans because Dominicans are cute? Of course we are, and we're good, and we're the best. But there are people who are not the best, who are also good. How do we schedule our times for reflection, decision, action, collaboration? This already says something about who we are. So if peace and justice are eschatological and messianic, currently we can best hope for concord. Concord is about, we have the same vision in terms of drive. We have the same hope, and our hope is in the Lord and in the kingdom to be coming, okay? Not in my theory of justice. So we can share and be in concord, in accord, and chord here has to do with the heart in Latin, and be permeated with dissensus. We may be for justice and peace while disagreeing on what justice is, on what is the first thing we need to do in terms of justice. Okay, how do we deal with that? How do you spell it out? How does it come out how does a dissensus come out in an arena, in a group, without turning into a fight? How do you remind people of the concord so that the differences do not break the group, but strengthen it? And that sends us to how we process together in terms of arguing, justifying, deliberating, consenting, organizing, and commanding. These points on concord, peace, and argumentation, deliberation, consent, organization, it's basically a Thomistic structure that I'm bringing in here. How do we deal internally with differences in opinions and tensions? How do we argue with one another? We're in a world where now I share my opinion with you, I share what I believe, you share it with me, and okay, that's good, let's move on. Well, in a group which is about justice and peace, you need to argue. Sharing opinions is one thing. Arguing to get something done is another one. Okay. And what's the structure to come to decisions beyond arguments that are about particular things? So they can't be dogmatic decisions. And how do we reach out to other groups and or accept their invitations? Last two questions, and I'm done. I'll be on time. How do we, and those are the questions that have been underlying all of what I've been saying. How do we understand and present ourselves to one another so as to be, feel, and act as a we. How do we represent ourselves to others as we do this? Does it make others see, feel, understand that we are open to them, to personally each one of them, and also to them as representatives of diverse groups, interests, and projects? And this is never a given. The last slide, which when you get the PowerPoint, we'll get, is some bibliographical elements that might help you go further if you wish, in line of what I said. So I will stop sharing here and give in French we say the cachoir. I'll give Brendan, I think, or Reg, whoever is in charge, or Dieudonné, to shut me up and send us into a break.
Maxime, I was really interested in your comparing or using the South Africa, the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Now that was written after. Was that written after Mandela became president?
It was written before, as part of the CODESA II movement and institution working on the Constitution. They worked very hard to do that. Mandela was part of the process, but it was a joint effort linked to what we used to call CODESA II, which stands for Commission of Something for South Africa.
Okay. So, in fact, when they said how they started theirs with what did they start? Their idea of we was very inclusive.
Very inclusive, and inclusive of the fact that they had hurt each other.
Right.
And it had been unfair to another, and being together was about healing that and taking that into consideration so that real justice could come about.
Right.
Whereas the American Constitution is very abstract. It's for all sorts of good things in the future, but not acknowledging the complexity of how the 13 colonies got together and what is not included in there.
Well, that's the question I was going to ask you. Does it matter that in our Constitution, when the framers were writing it, that we really was white male landowners.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't, and that's who they were thinking of when they wrote that. How do you think that has impact on us in terms of our own? I mean, even as we, we're so many years away from it, but do you think that has some impact on our consciousness in terms of how we see we in this country still?
I wouldn't say it has impact on consciousness in the sense that most people are not even aware of that text or do not think it much, but it forces a process of appropriation and interpretation, which basically would lead, if it was done, to writing a text that would sound more like the South African situation. But it's also a reminder that when we say we speak as the people, we might be excluding people or having forgotten people or not know that there are people on the side because they're totally invisible.
Right, yeah.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for coming back. And I hope you enjoyed a good conversation. I have a mower right outside my window, which you might hear. So if you have a question for Maxime or want to make a comment from your group, we don't want reports back. But down in the reactions, there's a place where you can raise your hand, or you can raise your regular hand on your body if you want, and I'll see you, I hope. And I'll ask Brendan and Reg to help me. So is there anyone who would like to pose a question or make a comment to Maxime?
I think Sharon was about to, weren't you? to Kathy's note.
Well, I was just gonna make a further comment on that as a former history teacher. I just think that it's in our cultural DNA, which in effect is in our subconsciousness about the fact that we, the people in the United States, are white male landowners, because the whole systems that developed as a result of that, political and economic systems, were based on that premise and are still based on that premise. So in that regard, I think it very much is part of the cultural subconscious of the U.S. That was all I was going to say.
I refrain usually from using conscious and subconscious because of theoretical problems. My training, and I've done a lot of things in psychoanalysis, is I find it very difficult to use the concepts of psychoanalysis at a social level, and I try and find other ways of dealing with it. But what Sharon, I think I agree with you, is that, in fact, the fact that it was a certain number of rich white landowners, politicians and things like that, and church people that got together and drafted that very nice text. And for the 18th century, it's a fascinating text, but it reminds us that for the purpose of the talk where I wanted to initiate today, that when in good faith we say we, okay, we might not always totally master the conditions of enunciation of the we, in the sense we might not even be aware that we're excluding people, and we might want to be very inclusive, and yet there is exclusion that will happen. And even if today we could say you've got lots of very rich financial and owners that are women that could be Black or Hispanics or things like that, the structure itself is still about a proto-capitalist structure. What I like about the South African constitution is that this is part and parcel of the fabric of how they try and understand themselves and transmit it from one generation to the other, to use the word conscious, so that when you're saying that to every new generation, there is still the idea that we've come a long way, but maybe not that long. We haven't gotten to the point where justice is done and we can just take it from there and say we're good from now on, which is sometimes the temptation of different people. We just want to buttress what is and engage new people within our groups. But as I was saying earlier, borders need to be displaced also, and that's more difficult than just welcoming a person.
Thank you. Marceline?
Thank you. That's the systemic piece of it. Following up Kathy and Sharon's comments makes me think the church also fits that as well. And I shared in my group, and I may have said this to the group before, Brian Massengill's book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, he comments that in the 1970 Bishop's Pastoral, the title of the pastoral is Brothers and Sisters to Us. And he asked the question, who is the us?
Yeah.
And so it's the white church, of course. But it just, as we're doing this, it makes me think, that defining the us and the we, it's power. And power comes into this. And so I want to hold this in a way, if we're going to make a wider we, it's not one that I want to have power over, but that there's some kind of inclusivity in it. But it's...
If I may respond, Mary Ellen, to the comment. The danger in the inclusive discourse on the whole is what I'd call too much Christianity, too much charity. The Thomist in me is speaking here. The idea is there will always be power. There will always be authority. there will always be an institution which already has a structure where authority and power, which are not the same thing, are at work. So being inclusive is about integrating people in that structure, but it's also transforming that structure so that there's place for others and that authority and power may be. But it's a very complex thing, theoretically and in philosophy, but also practically, because in different places you can see, and we've seen it in South Africa and in other parts of in the Anglican Church, you can become more inclusive, and yet the people who are included are getting formatted or choose to act according to the older standards of power and authority. So you can have, for example, blacks in South Africa who will act as if they were white Afrikaner. Of course, they're black and they've got the struggle and the injustice, but their way of being of integrating and of wanting to be integrated is to be part of the type of power that was there instead of wanting to transform it. Been seen also in the Anglican Church when women became priests and bishop. Women can also be very clerical. Sorry to put it delicately like this, as Dieudonné, Son Hong, and Brendan, myself, and Raymond are kind of minority here, but you've had superiors in your communities that were, in fact, male in the way they related to power. Again, it's not a very delicate way of saying it, but it's the shorthand way of saying it goes beyond just being more inclusive and transforming the structures of power. It requires a conversion in the person who comes in or is already in relation to power. Okay? Because lots of frustration and nice words on charity cover up sometimes all sorts of abuse of power. And we've had that enough for 2,000 years. Let's not be inclusively moving forward in the same direction.
Thank you, Maxime. Laura?
And this is just kind of occurring to me, but I'm as we start as a congregation, I know, to start looking through the lens of integral ecology in our decision making and our approach to all issues, whether that also helped to widen the we. If we begin to see all the connections among groups or people, I don't know. I think it just brings a certain amount of perhaps intentionality to just approaching the topic.
I'd say yes and no. Yes, as a possibility. Yes, as a hope. But nothing is mechanic there, because seeing more connections can lead to imposing yourself to more people and more things and more beings. It's not automatic, okay? And that's why I'm saying yes as a hope, yes as a possibility, but you can end up, and you see it in some discourses, at least on the philosophical side of deep ecology, the domination moves from human beings to some other species, okay? And that's not better, okay? It's this whole paradigm that needs to be transformed. So the understanding of connection is great, and I think it's fundamental, but we have to see that connecting to one another can be with animals and other beings and with life as such, if we want to go that far, is also a way of expanding anthropocentric domination. I'll put it delicately. You have people who have a dog or a cat, but the cat or the dog is the leader in the house. That's not, it's lots of connection, but it's not better connections than dominating the animal, okay? So I think it's a challenge and it's a call we have to think about being with and for in different ways. And the multiplication of connections and of types of connections is an occasion to invent new ways of thinking it, but we're kind of behind the times where the urgency of what's coming up is forcing us to think more quickly. And I can assure you that, at least at the philosophical level, there's lots of resistance to new modes of thinking. Because strategic, instrumental reason is very, very powerful and very strong. And going beyond that is very difficult. But there are avenues, and I think integral approach to creation and to the interconnection of beings is a necessary condition to help us see differently and think differently. So you're right. I know where your congregation is there at that point, but it's definitely an occasion for new forms of thinking, new forms of government, new forms of spending, of using space, time, etc. And it's a challenge. Last fall, I gave a course on theology of creation, and I went in and I was exploring those avenues, and it was interesting to see the resistance of even some of the very students that were very much into ecology and integral thinking, because it meant major conversions in terms of way of living. And that's always the challenge.
Thanks, Maxime. Anyone else have a comment, question? Okay. If not, I'm just going to remind you that we're going to reconvene.
Marceline had a question.
Okay, Marceline.
You got to unmute, Marceline.
I was waiting to see if someone else, because I've already spoken.
Okay.
So
Go ahead, please.
But I don't know how this fits into it, but it occurred to me, we're speaking about, you said theology of creation, and some things you said, I saw Sharon shaking her head. It reminds me that of Elia Delio's column recently, and I've read it in other ways. You know, the bishops are going to do this document on Eucharist, U.S. bishops. And her comment being that our theology is based on medieval thinking, and what we need to do in terms of theology, to base it on, you know, our understandings with the universe story and how our thinking has evolved, and our theology doesn't fit with that. And in a sense, maybe it's not connected to this, but I think it still is in its own way.
I would say that we need more medieval to be able to jump to postmodern. The reason is the idea of dominating nature is a modern 16th, 17th century idea, that because the medieval ages had a sense of integration. If you read Hildegard of Bingen, for example, they had in the medieval ages a sense of the unity of the cosmos, and the idea of exploiting nature and transforming it the way we've been doing since the late 16th, 17th century, and the way we've understood it is not present there. So on a good day, when I want to be facetious but not too facetious, I say, how about we take a step back, look at some of the things linked to the medieval, and it's going to help us jump over a lot of the rationalistic, capitalist, sovereign state approach that we have in modernity. And just to speak to I don't know what the bishops are going to come up with, but I can be on my knees in front of the Blessed Sacrament to hope for the best, but I know the best will not happen. Sorry, I don't trust bishops on the whole. Don't quote me on that. Okay, take that off the recording. I'll deny I said that. But the idea is, again, the medieval sense of the Eucharist was much more inclusive than what we've made it to be since the 19th century. Okay? So I agree. We can't stick with medieval categories, maybe, et cetera, but the medieval ages can be a teacher to make us understand that the church has not been the same for 2,000 years. The post-Tridentine church is something that was a novelty, and that has led us into all sorts of dead ends. Exploring our past can open paths to the future. In the same way as Vatican II went to the what they called then the Church Fathers. I don't know how you call them in English anymore nowadays, but it's definitely not Church Fathers, I imagine. But, you know, Chrysostom and them people, they went to that to unblock the 19th century. I think on creation and other things, some of the medieval meditations of our brothers and sisters, especially in the Dominican tradition, could help us move forward. Catherine of Siena has very interesting things there.